Hello one and all, a very warm welcome to another instalment from the channel that is Jono's Graveyard Jaunts. In today's episode, I'm once again in the beautiful county of Northamptonshire. Specifically, I'm at Kingsthorpe Cemetery in Northampton, where the person who features in today's video is laid to rest. Now the first map shows where the county of Northamptonshire sits in relation to the UK, and the second map shows where Kingsthorpe Cemetery sits in relation to Northampton itself. Now today's video is about a woman who became infamous for attempting to assassinate the fascist leader Benito Mussolini in 1926 whilst he was in Rome, Italy. The person who is the topic of today's video is a lady by the name of Violet Gibson. So who was Violet Gibson then, and where did she come from? Now, Violet Gibson was born in Dublin, Ireland on the 31st of August 1876. And as a child, Gibson was often sick with scarlet fever, pleurisy, bouts of ill-defined hysteria, and she also had a violent temper. During her younger years, she showed an interest in Christian Science and then Theosophy, but at the age of 26 in 1902, she converted to Catholicism. Her upbringing was one of privilege, growing up in Merrion Square in Dublin. Her father was an Irish lawyer and made a first Baron Ashbourne in 1885 and went on to serve as Lord High Chancellor of Ireland from 1885 to 1905. Her mother Frances was a Christian Scientist. She grew up dividing her time between Dublin and London, and at the age of 18 was a debutante in the court of Queen Victoria. Now, a debutante essentially is a marriageable young woman from the upper echelons of society who is actually presented to society, and usually that takes place at a formal ball, for example. 2 years later, along with a nurse named Mary McGrath, she travelled to Rome where she lived in a convent. And by this point, she was convinced that God had wanted her to kill someone as a sacrifice. And in February of 1925, Gibson got hold of a gun and shot herself in the chest. Now, miraculously, she survived. In March of 1926, Gibson's mother passed away, and by 1913, Gibson had been married to an artist and widowed. So Gibson's time in Paris then. She then moved to Paris and worked for various pacifist organisations, and in that same year, she contracted Paget's disease, which is an abnormal breakdown of bone tissue, and a mastectomy left her with a 9-inch scar. She then returned to England where surgery for appendicitis left her with chronic abdominal pains. Now Gibson in turn became more and more obsessed with religion during her 40s, and she went on retreats, followed the Jesuit scholar John O'Fallon, Pope, and became fixated on the ideas of martyrdom and mortification. And by 1922 she had had a nervous breakdown and was committed to a mental asylum, having been declared insane. Now, the attempted assassination on Mussolini then. And by April of that year, her obsession with killing someone had refocused. It was now trained on Mussolini. And on that fateful day of April the 7th, 1926, Gibson went to Palazzo di Littorio with her gun wrapped in a black veil and a rock in case she needed to break Il Duce's car windshield. While Il Duce, i.e. that was another name for Mussolini, drove through Rome's Piazza del Campidoglio, leaving left an assembly of an International Congress of Surgeons where he had delivered a speech on the wonders of modern medicine, Gibson jumped from the crowd and shot the leader. Her rock was unnecessary as the leader walked among the crowds just feet from Gibson. Her first shot grazed his nose, and on the second shot, the gun misfired. Now the fascist leader stayed very calm and told the crowd, "Don't be afraid." Later he said that while he was ready for a beautiful death, he did not want to die at the hands of an old, ugly, repulsive woman, I quote. In custody for her crimes, Gibson said she shot Mussolini, and I quote, "to glorify God, who has sent an angel to keep her steady." The Gibson family in turn wrote to the Italian government to apologise for her actions, and Gibson was in turn declared a chronic paranoiac and returned to England and St Andrew's Hospital in Northamptonshire. Mussolini was only slightly injured, and after having his nose bandaged, he continued his parade. Now, of the 4 people who attempted to assassinate Il Duce, she came the closest. And what was the aftermath then of the assassination attempt? Now, Gibson was imprisoned in Rome after the assassination attempt, but later released without charge on the orders of Mussolini before she was deported to Britain. Now, Benito Mussolini was finally killed on April 28, 1945, during the final days of World War II. He and his mistress were taken to Milan and left in a suburban square hanging upside down from a metal girder above the service station. So who was Mussolini then? Now, Mussolini was described as a restless child. He was disobedient, unruly and aggressive. He was a bully at school and moody at home. He was also very intelligent and he passed his final examinations without difficulty. Now, Mussolini formed the National Fascist Party in 1921 and then came to power in Italy in the aftermath of World War I, backed by the armed group known as Black Shirts, who intimidated opponents. The fascists seized power in the early 1920s in Italy, dismantling democratic institutions, and Mussolini became Italy's dictator in 1925. He supported General Francisco Franco in Spain's civil war and also backed Adolf Hitler in World War II. Now, Mussolini did adopt some of Hitler's policies, notably the anti-Jewish laws of 1938 that stripped Italy's Jews of their civil rights. Now, more than 7,500 Italian Jews died in the Holocaust. Now, Violet Gibson died in 1956 at St Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital in Northampton. She had been incarcerated there since her assassination attempt on Mussolini in 1926 when she was aged 50 years old. Now, Gibson passed away aged 79 years old, having spent 29 years in a psychiatric hospital, and there were no mourners at her funeral. Now, there was a plaque erected at Merrion Square in Dublin, where she actually lived with her father in March of 1921. The plaque described her very interestingly as, and I quote, a committed anti-fascist, and the plaque was unveiled in Dublin on the 20th of October of that year. So here we are at the final resting place of Violet Gibson, who died in 1956, and as we know in the video, she became infamous for attempting to assassinate Mussolini in 1926 when he was in Rome in Italy. Now, Violet Gibson clearly had mental health issues. She'd already shot herself and survived. And when she shot Mussolini in 26, she was incarcerated at Northampton Psychiatric Hospital until she died at the age of 79. So she spent a total of 29 years in a psychiatric unit. And I think we probably all agree in those days, if we look at the labelling associated with mental illness, you know, it was called a lunatic asylum, and the attitude in those days, I think, was just lock them up and throw away the key, and I think that's literally what they did with poor Violet. And I think what's really interesting and sad is she didn't have any mourners at her funeral. May you rest in peace, Violet. God bless. Now that concludes the video, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe and comment on the video.